Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so happy that you're here. As you're coming in, feel free to drop your name, your pronouns, your role in organization, and why you chose to be here today. We're excited to get to know y'all. Welcome, everybody. So happy you're with us today. Soon to be parent. Welcome. Preparing the environment. Oh, hi, Becky. Welcome, welcome. Oh, Whitney, I'd love to connect with you. All right. Welcome, everyone. We're so happy that you're here today. They've taken a little bit of time out of your day to join us. We're going to dive right in because we have a lot to talk about. And just so you know a little bit about the structure, I'm going to do a brief introduction. We'll have a few questions, and then we're going to open it up at the end for some question and answer time, since we know maybe you all might have some questions. I want to preface by saying that none of us here are positioning ourselves as experts. We're all learning alongside each other and alongside all of you. So really, this is going to be more conversational in nature, in part also because it's our hope to model new ways of being white that really challenge that kind of silence around directly discussing race and racism. So I have known all of these beautiful folks for anywhere from 10 to 5 to 10 years, maybe no longer, 12 years in the case of Christina here now. And so when I began my PhD work, which I specifically undertook because I wanted to look at how white children are developing their racial identities. When I started my doctoral dissertation, I reached out to them to work in partnership because I knew that they were asking the same sorts of questions that I had. And so over the course of the last 2 years, I was able to go and spend time in their homes. I was able to spend time in conversation and community with them. I saw them with their children and with their families. And we asked some of these big questions together about what it means to be white people trying to raise anti-racist white children in a way that most of us had never seen before. So before we dive in too deeply, I want to give everybody a chance to introduce themselves. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Katie. My pronouns are they, them. I just finished my doctoral program at Chapman University, which is on Ahashiman land in so-called Southern California, where I am currently. And for the last 4 years, I've worked as the English-speaking elementary guide at Karis Children's Learning Center. And now I'm also serving as the lead facilitator at Embracing Equity, which I've also worked with Embracing Equity for the past 5 years or so. And during this process of writing this dissertation, doing this research, my partner and I got pregnant with, and I gave birth to our first baby. So we kind of had this moving from theory into practice situation, and I feel really grateful to have learned from these beautiful folks and people who did group conversations with us as we did. So I'm grateful for everybody here who's raising kids and maybe about to raise kids. So I'll hand it off to our participants and Christina.
Hi, I'm Christina. My pronouns are she and they. I'm a special education and autism specialist in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I work with students with moderate disabilities and really work to center equity and make equity work accessible and appropriate for all students. I live with my partner and 2 children in Minneapolis, and really happy to be here.
Hi, y'all. I'm Lara. I use she, her pronouns. I am also located in Minneapolis. And for those of you who've never been here, this is the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. I am a Montessori trained early childhood educator, have spent 15 years in Montessori classrooms. And I also have 2 children, a rising 3rd and 5th grader. And we live here in Minneapolis, and I'm excited to join the conversation with y'all.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie. I also use she, her pronouns. I am joining us today from the ancestral land of the Lenape, just outside New York City. But my partner and I are raising our children in Southern Virginia, near Yorktown on the ancestral Powhatan land. And I've been a Montessori educator and public history educator for 13 years. I was lucky to have found embracing equity very early on in my educational career. And this sort of became my home and my people who pushed me along and who allowed me to build relationships that were super nurturing, but also very challenging in all of the ways that I thought I was walking through the world. So if you're looking for any of that, I hope you're able to find some of that here with us today.
Thanks so much, Carrie. Yeah, I think, you know, like I said, this is what brought me to doing my PhD program was this question. I had been working alongside colleagues of the global majority doing anti-racism organizing work, and several of them, including my good friend Trisha Mokino, lovingly said, you know, we're good. We need you to work with white folks. And so that's, you know, that's really what brought me to reflecting on. So that time I had no idea that I would ever be a parent. And so, you know, this question for me started as a participant in other people's children's lives also. And so one question that I wanted to start with, because I think for me, I can speak for myself, there was a lot of anxiety about how to start doing this work with white children because I had very few models. I didn't know what to look for. And so I'm wondering if anybody would like to share a little bit about, are there any barriers that you're currently facing or that you initially faced when you started really undertaking this work? And if there are any moments that you can specifically think about that maybe you didn't engage when you wanted to or didn't look the way you wanted to?
I'll start and also give a plug for embracing equity. I think the first barrier for me was even knowing how whiteness was showing up in my life. You know, I think having language to talk about the systems of oppression that we are walking through every day, and especially as white folks, they are intentionally invisibilized to us, right? And so just doing my own work and having sort of that deep knowing that there's something here that I need to understand better. I had been an educator and I had my kids, and I always thought I was a good intentioned person that celebrated diversity, and I'm from this big urban city. But as soon as I found embracing equity, people were asking me like, well, what are you learning? What are you taking away? And I said, question everything. And so then with my own kids living in Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd, I mean, we're a couple miles from 38th and Chicago where it happened. And so our entire city was going through this very public reckoning. And, it pulled the veil back for us as a community. But in my personal life, at the time, my kids were 2 and 4. And I'm an early childhood educator, and I'm like, yeah, we're going to talk about this. And so there was the swirl of resources, right, for white folks to learn about whiteness and anti-racism. And a children's book called Something Happened in Our Town was recommended. And if you're familiar with it, it's about police brutality from the perspective of a white family and a Black family. And so I read this book. I did, thought I was doing the work, and I read this book with my children shortly after the murder of George Floyd. And I realized as I was reading it, and then the conversations afterwards, that I had not done the work with my own children. I had not laid the foundation for us to be able to have really meaningful conversations about police brutality and the reality that many of our neighbors experience every day. So that was a big wake-up call. And, there's always the kind of gut instinct to feel shameful about that. But again, because of what I had learned in embracing equity, was that I had tools to move past that shame and into action right away. So that kind of resulted in our family kind of backpedaling and using a foundation of the goals in the anti-bias education framework of just understanding who my children's identity was for themselves, so that we could start talking about sort of when we see the injustices happening, what are the dynamics at play there, but doing it in not a developmentally appropriate way, but a developmentally accessible way.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. I think that when starting the work and when we start having kids and we're starting to teach anything, we want to make sure that we know exactly what to say, what to do. We're going to teach them the right way because they're these little sponges that we're forming. And something that I found throughout the journey is that perfectionism is actually a tenet of white supremacy, and we have to be able to learn along with our children. And we have to be able to ask questions, mess up. We have to be able to say we're sorry, both to our kids and like the people in our community. I also think that we needed to change the way we talked at the beginning. We have conversations around slavery, for example, and say, Black people were enslaved, and instead we have to swap that narrative and say that white people did this. White people enslaved people, and just switch the subject and the verb of our sentences and how we tell that story. I think that it allows us to reframe who is in control in that situation and who needs to do the work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Laura. I think that really visibilizing, like even just saying white people, like really even identifying like, oh, this is a group and that we're associated with, because for white folks, like, for me growing up, a race was something that other people had. I didn't have a racial identity. No thought was really put into how I was developing my own racial identity. And that's reflected also in the literature. Now we're starting to have this sort of, new wave of critical whiteness studies that's coming along, where people are starting to really look more at white children and how we're developing those we're developing those identities. But really there's so little literature, there are so few models and so few resources. And I think that really, I was thinking about a mistake that I made. I'm a new parent, so it's interesting to have these conversations from a place now being a parent. And so I'm going to share a story that's not directly related to race, but I would argue all of these conversations are related to race and racism because they're all interconnected, which is part of what I learned too, working with Laura and Christina and Carrie. But I was at dinner we were at one of my friends' houses, and one of my friends has a child who was assigned female at birth. Our child was assigned male at birth. And so I was just waiting for there to be a matter of time somewhere in the world where somebody makes a comment like, oh, they're going to date someday. And so they did. And I very ungracefully was like, stop sexualizing the kids. And, I've had a lot of practice having these conversations around race and racism and would have had it in a more thoughtful way. But I just completely wasn't expecting it. And then started going through this process where I was like, oh my gosh, I feel so bad that I talked about that. It was like I was watching, as a queer person, watching that, for being forced into heterosexuality in front of me, watching that happen and that play out the same way that we watch socialization into whiteness play out. And I felt myself in such a visceral way saying no. And then as I reflected back on it, I followed back up with the person, and I was thinking like, it really, like Christina was saying before, it isn't about this like perfect approach to it. And for me, this work is about how do we shift culture. And so the culture, if we want to raise anti-racist white children, we have to create anti-racist white cultures. And the culture isn't about that perfection, that I know exactly the right thing to say in the exactly supportive way to say it with grace and with invitation in and growth. It's that if I don't do that, that I address it and I can bring it back up. And I trust that the people that I'm in partnership with are in the same place with me. And that's what it is, like that we're constantly like, oh, there's our socialization again. Oh God, there it is. Oh no. And that we can collectively, instead of having all of this shame and guilt, that we can just say matter of factly, like Christina was saying too, no, white people did this. Christina, is it okay if I share a story about your child okay, so Christina's child at the time had just turned 5 or was in January. Yeah, 4 or just turned 5 or recently turned 5 and woke up early in the morning, 5:30. I was working on field notes and I could just see them like in the in the periphery. And so I put my laptop down and I was like, oh, good morning. And they were like, hi, do you want to ask me any questions about racism? And I was like, I do. As a matter of fact, I do. And so we had this whole conversation where this child described what colonization is, described, racism as unfairness, talked about the idea that anti-racism is specifically named white people taking responsibility. But the thing that stuck out to me the most was the last part of the conversation where they said, I said to them, did you know that in some families, some white families, they don't talk about racism at all? And they said, oh, that's weird. And I was like, what you don't realize, this speaks to like this cultural piece, you don't realize that no, actually, that's what's typically happening and what's happening here. But because that's their cultural experience, they think that that's strange. So I think that for me, this barriers is like, how do we create this white culture collectively, and how the relearning around that is so challenging. I don't know if anybody else has any other reflections about that.
Well, that's one of the things that I remember Katie led my white anti-racist cohort at Embracing Equity, that you asked was like, this is an opportunity, an invitation to reimagine what it means to be white, not being complicit in these tenets that are ultimately harming all of us, not just, the marginalized communities that we can think of off the top of our head. So for me, I think, yeah, when you think about like what is another way of being, and I think in my parenting, what's another way of parenting. I think sometimes it's easier to imagine, the world that we want to create for our children, than it is for us to think that in our lifetime, right here, right now, there's another way of being. And so definitely, finding community, finding partners to encourage you and co-create with you is a critical part of reimagining what that culture could be.
Thanks, Laura. And I think that really kind of brings us into our next question, which is that we know that we can't do this work alone. So if we are really looking at building culture, that's not something you can do individually. And so I'm wondering for you, what does it look like? What does anti-racist caregiving look like with your caregiving partners? So that could be your primary partner or partners who you are raising children with. It could be people in your extended community who are raising. Like, what does that look like for you? Has it been challenging since the beginning? Has it been you're already super connected and in step from the beginning? What does that anti-racist, when you're trying to raise anti-racist white children, what does that relationship look like?
I I remember thinking that, all along growing up, you envision your friendships as people you have like some kind of shared common interest with, people whose time you enjoy, you do the same kind of activities. And all of that was true in becoming a parent as well. But now, when you're doing this healing work for yourself and you're trying to, again, imagine a different way of moving through the world, all of a sudden I had this constant calculus of like, well, these people that I'm bringing into my world, I need to be able to trust that these are the same people who have some kind of shared values of mine. My partner is active duty military, so we've moved around quite a lot. And I know that community is something lots of military partners and spouses crave. And so people might find themselves in relationships with people out of a place of need or out of a place of convenience. And I totally hear that. But I remember while we were living abroad, we lived in the Netherlands for 3 years, thinking through of like, I would rather have one or two very close partnerships as long as these were people that I knew were going to be people who would hold me accountable when I was behaving in a way that was harmful or thinking in ways that were harmful to me or to the world around me. And also that I could walk away from my child and know that if they were upholding some kind of behavior that was harmful to themselves or to people around them, that my friend, my parenting partner would also step in that instance as well. And that's everything from pushing back on my kiddo or our kiddos when they are holding up perfectionism, when they're either or thinking, any of those little ways that it shows up. And I would not be honest if I said that there are not relationships that over the course of the last 7 or 8 years, I don't nurture the way that I used to because of the intentional shift of nurturing relationships with people I have all over the globe, who really do pour into themselves in trying to imagine a different world for themselves and their families, and also are supporting me in doing that for myself as well. And that's not an easy thing to do. I know that that's something that growing criticality, growing an anti racist lens for the world around you. One of the big things that I think might stop a lot of people from doing that is the idea of a lost relationship or the idea of a lost friendship. And I've been there in both circumstances, and I can't say that that's easy. But once you have articulated for yourself and for your community what upholding your values feels like, um, there's a whole lot of support in those communities. I mean, nobody here in this conversation is going to tell you like you're going to feel so good. You're going to feel so good once you leave all those. No, nobody here is going to tell you that. I do have a feeling I can tell you with confidence that everybody here would support you and being like, we've been there and it's hard. And that's not a reason to not do it. So I remember having conversations with the people on the screen with us, with Katie, when Katie came to visit, and thinking through like, wow, like even the way that I befriend people in adulthood has to be thoughtful, has to be critical. It's not just what am I reading? What podcasts do I listen to? It's literally every single decision that we're making in our world. How can we be shifting in these small ways to be more intentional? How can we be shifting in different ways to reflect the world that we want to build around us, instead of just waiting for somebody to be like, okay, we solved all of those problems. Here you go. Here's that world you were imagining. Instead of knowing I don't have to do all these big things. If I'm more intentional about just the way I build relationships and who I nurture, especially around my kids, my students, right? That's a way of bringing about this world that we're talking about.
I think I would add to that, there are some relationships that do need to continually be nurtured so that you can grow together. As Carrie mentioned, parenting partners can be other parents in your community. But I think when a lot of us think of parenting partner, we think about the person that, is raising children in our household if we are partnered in a household together. And I think one of the things that I have had a lot of growing around is how to have two people that are raising children, that we're not always on the same page. I think one of the favorite things that happens in our family now that my kids are a little older is around the dinner table. Well, something will come up and my husband and I will have different perspectives. Ultimately, we'll kind of have the same value, but we'll have different perspectives on how we got there. And I know early on in my journey, my husband is not, he's biracial, so he has a different perspective too. But early on in our journey, we were, there was tension because I had all this new learning and I knew about whiteness, and I had to do some deep soul searching there too, and remember that relationships are work and they take humility and trust building and patience and love, and so some of the relationships that we have do take a little more work. And for my kids, what I want them to know is when they go out in the world, like absolutely find your community, find the people that are going to hold you accountable and uplift you. But that's not going to be everybody that's out there in the world, and we don't throw away anybody, right? I think that demonstrating that, I've not always been where I am, right? And so holding space, having compassion for the person I was 10 years ago, I can have that same compassion for folks. And you can kind of tell, right, if people are up for the conversation, up for the little bit of the push. But not everyone is going to be there, from 0 to 60. That's not how my journey went. And so relationship also, yeah, it just takes time and it takes nurturing and it takes patience. And especially when it's the person that you've committed your life to, just like all things, you're continuing to learn and grow together. And so making space for that journey is important too. Have you all seen those? I can't remember. It's a Black creator on, I don't know if it's TikTok or whatever, but it's like on a first date and like the things you mentioned, and then they make this hilarious face. They're like, so Black people were like amazing. And then like they make this really funny face. It's very good. It's like the litmus test of like when you're getting to know someone new, like, so what do you think about LGBT rights? It's very
Thanks, Laura. Thank you, Carrie. Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, I think, because there's no real roadmap for direct engagement with conversations around race and racism. And so, uplifting, Carrie, that idea of intentionality. I was talking with one of my Embracing Equity team members, and we were just joking about how some people are like, you're thinking about that too deeply. And it's like, no, everything is something. Everything is something. Everything has some kind of implicit messaging. And so, and our children are watching. They're watching whether or not we're choosing to engage with our partners. They're watching whatever partner means to us, whether that's the person that we are, if we have a primary partner or primary partners, people in our world, their teachers. And that's part of that, that constant feeling of, am I engaging? Am I not engaging? What does it mean when I don't? What does it mean when I do? Christina, I'm sorry. I thought I saw you unmute, so I'm gonna mute me.
It's okay. I was thinking about what Laura said and coming back to shared values and I think that's a really good starting place. And I know, Carrie, you've talked a lot about this as well, in that if you're starting this journey with a partner and community and just be like, hey, let's think about this and write down 3 things that we want to uphold. And then you always have that ground that you can go back to. And is this action or what we are doing upholding our values? So I think that's really important.
Thanks, Christina. I think that brings us beautifully into our next question and our last question before the Q&A, which is white folks really want a toolbox, like 5 tips to raise anti-racist kids. And from our collective work together, one of the findings was, sorry, there's not that. It doesn't exist. And how unsatisfying. So there's no such thing as 5 tips that will help you become anti-racist parents, although we would really encourage cultivating your own critical consciousness and building community with other people. That really helps. But other than that, what are, if you were saying this thing has really helped me navigate this big unknown building the plane while we're flying thing of white anti-racist parenting, what would you say?
I'll go first. So I like when the toolbox, the way I conceptualize it is there isn't a toolbox, but there is a screwdriver at the back of the junk drawer. And so we can dig through it and we can find it. And one of the things that has really helped me, particularly with trying to embrace learning in public and learning alongside my children and partner, is just to take time and just wait or ask, tell me more. Or what are you can buy yourself time and you can think about it. And also narrating that. There's been that same child that snuck up on you at 5 o'clock in the morning. There's been many times that I've said, I'm not ready. I don't know how to talk to you about this. So we need to put a pin in it. And I don't know how to answer that question right now. I'm still working on it. And those little, just being honest and getting more information is always a good rusty screwdriver for me.
Yeah, definitely utilize questions. I mean, those of us that are educators know that children in particular, I mean, all of us, but children are self-constructing. And so asking them questions not only lets us know what do they already know, but it is also building their consciousness, their critical consciousness, right? One thing, and I got this from Britt Hawthorne, who wrote a book called Raising Anti-Racist Children, a practical parenting guide. And it is exactly what it says it is. Please, please, please check it out. There's even activities in there that you can do with your parenting partners. Yeah, it's amazing. But one of the things that I learned from her was, you could just be driving down the road in a different part of town, and you could say, what do you notice here, right? And just building their awareness, or why do you think this is the way it is? Another story during the summer of 2020 was we had a lot of encampments popping up all over the city in parks, massive groups of unhoused people. And, in parts of the city, there wasn't usually a lot of that visible. And I just, remember that's a very visually like impressionable thing that the kids were taking in. And so just asking questions about like, why do you think these people are living out here? And then, again, they were still pretty young, but it allowed us to have conversations about, housing and taxes and health insurance. And my kids are always saying now, like, "Oh, Mom, why do you have to turn everything into a long conversation? Like, can't it just be a simple answer?" And to Katie's point, like, no, there's so much. And for me, it's just like, I didn't have someone having these conversations with me. It took over 30 years for me to get here. And I don't want you to have to do that same work because, first of all, the harm that we're unintentionally complicit in on the way there, but also they're your change makers. So I definitely recommend getting your hands on Brett's book as something in a not existent toolkit. I think that's just a really helpful way to give some really tangible things that we can be doing as parents, particularly with children.
Also say Christina had mentioned before in conversation that we have had together. I had mentioned before my partner is active duty, and my partner and I don't come from the same sort of upbringing. Not that mine was an anti-racist childhood by any stretch, um, but there were lots of conversations in our early parenting journey where I found myself walking away from lots of those conversations, um, just really frustrated and walking away wondering, like, why won't you just agree? Why won't you just agree that I see this right, you don't, and that I have a better way to go about this? And it led to a lot of a lot of conflict, which is not a bad thing, but it was not productive for our parenting by any stretch. So the two of us separated and had a chance to articulate in writing for ourselves what we wanted for our kids and for our family. And it was a chance for us to ground this conversation in these values instead of yelling at the other person about um, disagreements we were having. And so we're constantly playing with the language around this, but where our family is right now, I have a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. And where we are right now is we agree as a family with our interactions with other people, with our interactions with each other and our kids. We came down to curiosity, that no question is a bad question, that we're never going to shame each other or our kids for asking or observing or noticing things, and that we're going to talk to my family, my in-laws, our parenting partners, and let them know, like, we're not going to shame our kids for them noticing things happening in the world around them. The second one was humanity. So any single time we can shift anything in our language or our behavior to be more inclusive, to be more compassionate to the world around us, we're going to shift it. This was a way of us interrupting that, like, oh, the language is always changing. Like, why are you guys always changing the names for things? It was a conversation around, like, if we could be 1% more inclusive, 1% more compassionate, shouldn't we be doing that? Shouldn't we be doing the thing to make ourselves a little more open to the world? And the last one, as an homage to both of us growing through this together, was progress and repair. That those two things happened together. That when we mess up with our kids, when we mess up with each other, that we are intentional about the fix with each other. So I talk to my 7-year-old often. I'm not in the practice of demanding an apology from her, because the language we use is always around, look, what does this person need? Is there anything that you can do? And that shift is enough for us to recognize too, like, we have ownership in this, and this is what accountability looks like. It looks like repair, so that we can move toward progress. And it just left the door open for the two of us to come back together and be like, yeah, like, that conversation didn't feel so great. Like, can we come back to that? And it just left the door open for us to constantly be coming back to this list, constantly be coming back to these conversations, because the world keeps offering us more opportunities to confront it. Not that we need to go mining for it by any stretch, but we're constantly being offered these new opportunities. And now we had a shared list that we could kind of ground those conversations in, where both of us felt like the other person had your back for doing that work with the kids too. So that completely changed how my partner and I interacted around these things, and made it safe for both of us to admit to each other, like, I got asked this question before. I'm not 100% sure how to answer it. Like, here's what I'm thinking. Like, can we talk through this so that you knew the other person had your back, whether it was off stage or on stage when that conversation happened with that kiddo?
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thanks, Laura and Christina, too. I think mine's not like a quick tool in true self fashion. But but my biggest thing I think is really working on, and I'm like a broken record for anybody who's ever heard me talk about this before, working on healing my own shame and guilt around whiteness, because and my own whiteness, and for myself, imagining and then really actually believing that there are ways of showing up as a white person that challenge white dominance. Because without that, what I was doing instead was lashing out at other white people, trying to displace the shame and guilt, seeking absolution from people of color. And then now, when having a child, like, this is when white conservatives talk about, I'm sorry, shouldn't pigeonhole people, because it's not just conservatives, it's also people across the whole political spectrum. But we usually hear that as a talking point from conservative people against, teaching anti-bias, anti-racist education, is that white children will feel bad. They'll have a bad sense of self. The reality is that I spent time with all of these children. None of them have a negative sense of self. What they have instead is a strong sense of love and care from their families, a deep sense of justice, and a desire to confront it. Again, Christina's child said to me when I said, do you ever feel bad? Like, we're talking about white people doing bad things. Do you ever feel bad about it? And they said, no. If we didn't talk about racism, then how would I know how to fight it? And that's it. And the same, having these conversations with Carrie's children, with Laura's children, like, we're projecting all of this shame and guilt that we've internalized, that we've grown, and they don't have it yet. So if we don't heal it, if we don't take responsibility for it, if we don't imagine and embody and give life to new ways of being white, then yeah, we will transmit it. And so that to me feels like such a strong, I feel a very strong sense of responsibility to healing that, so that I can show up in a way where my child, the goal here isn't that white children are dehumanized. It's that everyone is humanized. And so I'm going to love my baby and all of their different identities and how they navigate them, and give them options for identities, whether because they're assigned male at birth, if it so happens that their gender identity aligns with that sex, then how do I give visions of masculinity that challenge a toxic masculinity? It's all of these. If we have a child who turns out that they're straight, what does it mean to show up and challenge Laura's laughing just as if that's not going to be but like, how do we challenge all of these systems of oppression? They're all interconnected. And children really, I say, children are a revolutionary subject. They have experiences of being silenced, of being controlled, of not feeling agency, because of how they live in the world. And so that's another, I'm going down a whole rabbit hole. Anyway, I'll just say.
That reminds me too, Katie, when you were visiting our family, I had this like aha moment of, I can't remember where it was in the pandemic, but we had a lot of time at home, and I realized, I had more time than I would usually have because of COVID. They weren't in school during the day, right? And so I would have like pretty regular like times when as a family would come together and or like me and my kiddos while we were home and like read a book and then have a conversation about it. And it was while you were visiting that I was realizing that, you know, some families, their values are put in action when they go to Sunday school or have Bible study, right? Like if we want this to be part of our family culture and our values, we have to be intentional. It can't be just waiting for the conversation to come up. It has to be just as intentional as the same way other families transmit their values. So that's another, I guess, not tip for your non-existent toolkit is like make it an intentional practice every once a week, you know, have a conversation and it'll give you practice too, you and your kids practice.
Thanks, Lara. I think we'll pass it to Valerie. I could say more about children. I'll say it very briefly because this is a real rabbit hole I could go down. Children are a revolutionary subject because they, without going too far into Marxist theory, they have those experiences of oppression. And so this is compounded for children of color, of course. But they're unfettered by, they're learning the way that society is working. They're learning those systems of domination and oppression, but they haven't yet internalized them. And so that combination of revolutionary potential with they are currently experiencing, like they don't dictate their schedules, even in the most, and I could say for like everybody currently on this panel, there was a lot of flattening of the hierarchy between adult and child. And still there are still hierarchies because we all live under capitalism and we have to go to work and you have to go to school and it's not a choice. And you have no political agency to be able to vote on whether or not that's how that works. And so that combined means that they really do have this ability to see and look right now for when we're looking at encampments on college campuses, we see young people being the ones who are the most and this is not just in this case, in every single movement that we see young people at the forefront, and it's because of these confluence of these, my guess is because of these things. So I want to open it up to the chat and any questions that are in there, switching into Q&A. Oh, it looks so fancy. Instead of looking forward to the future, I'm curious if anyone is reconnecting with your own ancestral past has been helpful or meaningful to anyone here. I would love if maybe Carrie might want to share a little bit about this. I would love if anybody does, but.
I would love to. Whitney, this is an awesome question. This is something that comes up in conversation in the white anti-racist cohort. And I will say my family is 100% Irish. I had an opportunity when we lived abroad to go and visit different areas throughout Ireland where my family is from, where my family had settled. I have a relative as well who was an IRA revolutionary, who was a political prisoner, and he and his friends were all executed by the British in 1916 during the Easter Uprising against British colonization of Ireland. Visiting sites related to my family, visiting sites related to my family's revolutionary past was super grounding for me personally. It allowed me to think through what actions I could be taking that don't necessarily feel revolutionary in the moment, but the way that they're disrupting things in my world and for me and for my kids feels really supportive. I will also say that it's a small well of extra energy, of extra stamina that I tap into when things feel difficult, to be able to say, like, I come from a revolutionary place. I come from revolutionary people. So when I, find myself stewing over events in the world, stewing over new information, stewing over a new understanding, I tell myself, also as a tool of self-compassion, of like, one of the reasons why I'm feeling this way is because this is a part of who I am. I am made to question these things. I come from people who question these things and who push back on these things, and that's okay for this to feel unsettling to me. That's why. So I would say that there is huge potential in connecting with an identity prior to whiteness. It's also an example that we can come back to and ground ourselves in, that choices were made. Choices were made to construct whiteness the way that it is in the context of the United States. And I'll also just add like a little footnote. By no means am I an expert here, but whiteness in other European countries and its proximity to anti-Blackness and what that looks like is not the same in the United States as it is in other places. I will just say quickly. So in the context of the United States, I can say that discovering a personal past, if you have a connection to one prior to the construction of whiteness in the United States, was super meaningful for me personally.
Laura, Christina, that resonating with either of you?
I think that this is a big area of growth for me, and thinking about my family, who one side of my family is Mexican, and I have that, and I present as white. I'm white, like that's how I identify, and that's a journey I'm on, is what I'll say.
Yeah, I mentioned that my husband is biracial. And so, like, for our children, even, it's very important to us that they stay connected to their Asian heritage and ancestors. And I think right around the same time I had this aha moment about whiteness, I realized, I mean, I was asking myself, well, what is my white culture? Because while there are those characteristics of white supremacy culture, we know that culture can be defined in many, many different ways. And it could be capital C culture. It can be, little c culture. So I just started kind of wondering about like where I come from. And I come from a talented seamstress, and and that is because she grew up on a farm, and they worked the land, and then they came from wherever, and then my ancestors that came from so I think this is definitely an area of growth for me too, and just like wanting to reconnect with my ancestry and knowing that it's not, one of the things that happens with whiteness is, as everyone sort of assimilates to try to get closer to that taste of power, we lose part of our identities, which is again why whiteness harms all of us. Like, our connection to our ancestors is really, really important. They're flowing through us, and whether they did some amazing revolutionary things that we know of, or we don't know anything at all, I think just trying to get in touch with it is a deeply healing exercise for white people. If you don't have a strong sense of, an ethnic or country in Europe that you come from.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you all so much. Yeah, I think it can feel overwhelming because, part of like being sucked up into whiteness is that a lot of us don't know or have connection to those ancestors. And I think, and there's also really intentional ways that has been obscured. And some of the things that make us most human, like, what do you do when a baby comes? What do you do when somebody dies? What do you do when somebody gets married? Like, all of these things, all of these markers that we have, or when a child comes of age, what do you do? That are celebrate the most human things now have been like the substitution in many, with whiteness that isn't connected to ethnicity, is like you buy things for people. you have a baby shower, but in a way that where you just like, I can just send somebody something and never even actually interact with them at all. I could do the same thing when they get married. And when they die, I could send some flowers. And then, so there's like this idea of consumption. And Reza Menachem talks about, even if we aren't able to do this reconnection for whatever reason, if the split is too deep where we can't reconnect, then reimagining collectively new ways together. New way, what do new, and in My Grandmother's Hands, Menachem talks about this, what goes through all of these things. Like, what would you do then? What is the new way of welcoming a baby without appropriating from other cultures, without taking things out of context, without that? What does it mean then? What do we do? And for many of us, it doesn't have to mean getting rid of our home and our family cultures. There's a reason why folks have shown up in this place. And I ask this question to everybody because a lot of this work also is like, how do I throw away everything that happened at my in my childhood because it was all wrong and nobody ever talked to me about racism? And instead, one of my advisors, when I was writing my dissertation, really challenged. She's like, there's a reason why people are showing up to this work. Chahudi and Jefferson did a study where they said only 10% of white people illustrate what they call racial empathy for Black people. And so have like a sense of care. And so that 10% of people, why are you showing up? There's something, whatever it is that, and maybe it wasn't our caregivers directly. Maybe it was in school. Maybe it was whatever. But there are, like, my parents may not have ever talked about whiteness, but they sure did talk about generosity. They sure did talk about reciprocity. They sure did talk about respecting all people. My dad was out in the neighborhood with all the different neighbors that, hanging up awning and putting down flooring and constantly sharing everything that we had. And those things all challenged some of those norms around white dominance. So even if you can't connect with what your ethnic, like your ancestors, your ethnicity, like there are ways to reimagine and to heal some of that too. We can evolve culture instead of replace. Exactly. Yeah. So we could do this for like 6 more hours. And we do, the four of us do. So anytime you want to come on over to our houses, we'll just share some tea. But it is coming time for us to wrap up. And so with that, first, I want to thank all of my co-panelists. I feel so profoundly grateful that I have gotten to learn with and alongside you. And I feel really grateful for this work, as I was preparing to bring our baby into the world, and also for myself, and look forward to continuing to do this. I'll say, if you want to contact the presenters, whoever wants to can drop their email into the chat. I don't want to do that for folks. I'm putting mine in there. I also want to uplift, if you're interested in parenting, and you should be, and the role that family and parent advocacy can have. Next week, we're going to have another webinar with the incredible, world-shaking Wilhelmina Yazzie, who is part of the critical and crucial decision in New Mexico, the Yazzie Martinez versus State of New Mexico case, which is looking at how is New Mexico failing children, Indigenous children, children with disabilities, children who speak languages other than English at home, and what exactly is the state doing to address it, and what has happened since that case, what has shifted in New Mexico. And it really speaks to the role that parents and caregivers can have in addressing these issues. And just to say, for those of you who are white caregivers who are showing up, this is an example too of going and listening and saying, how can we show up in solidarity? So we've got future webinars that you can sign up for. Also, beyond this, we really try to bring in a variety of voices and lots of different topics. And then we also have our program waitlist, which y'all have seen dropped throughout. We would love to see you in the White Anti-Racist Identity Development cohort. I'll probably be there facilitating. And I would love to see you there. I would love to chat with you. So please feel free. I didn't catch you drop their emails, but feel free to email any of us who did. I'm happy to stay in touch with any of y'all. And thank you for coming and for imagining new ways of being white with us. So I hope you have a great rest of your day.